Welcome back. If you haven't seen part 1 of this series yet, the link is below. It covers the road that brought Europe to the edge of this moment, because today we're stepping right onto that edge. Here is a question that should stop you cold. Two of the most powerful nations in Western Europe, Britain and France, formally declared war on Nazi Germany. They had armies, they had air forces, they had solemn promises written in ink and read aloud in Parliament, and yet Poland, the country they went to war to defend, was completely destroyed in just 35 days. How does that happen? How do you declare war for a country and then watch it die? That is the story of this video, and to understand it, you have to go back to the moment the West finally thought it had found a way to stop Hitler, and the moment that illusion was shattered forever. Cast your mind back to September 1938, the Munich Agreement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain steps off a plane waving a piece of paper, talking about peace in our time. Germany had been given the Sudetenland, the western fringe of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a promise that Hitler wanted nothing more. The logic was appeasement. Give a hungry man a meal, and he stops being hungry. Except this particular hunger was something else entirely. On the 15th of March, 1939, Hitler proved it. German forces marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, the territory that Munich had explicitly guaranteed would remain sovereign. No provocation, no pretext that could hold up to even casual scrutiny. Just tanks rolling through a capital city in broad daylight. Munich hadn't bought peace. It had bought Hitler time and handed him confidence. The message it sent back to London and Paris was brutal in its clarity. This man does not stop. The political shockwave across Europe was immediate. Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement, stood in the House of Commons just 2 weeks later and made an extraordinary reversal. On the 31st of March, 1939, Britain and France issued a formal guarantee to Poland. If Polish independence were clearly threatened, both nations pledged, in the language of the declaration itself, all support in their power. France echoed the commitment. The line had been drawn, or so it appeared. But here is where you have to look past the language and ask what that guarantee actually meant in practice. What military machinery stood behind those words? Because a promise is only as strong as the force prepared to enforce it. Britain in the spring of 1939 was still in the middle of a rearmament program that was nowhere near complete. The British Expeditionary Force existed on paper in far greater strength than it existed in readiness. France had the Maginot Line along the German border, a monument to defensive thinking at a moment when the world was about to discover what offensive warfare could look like. Neither country had a realistic plan to project military power into Eastern Europe at speed. The Polish border was nearly 1,000 miles from the English Channel. Think about what it would have taken to get there in time. So the guarantee was real in political will, at least on the surface, but fragile in military reality. And this gap, this yawning distance between what was promised and what could actually be delivered, would define everything that followed. Now here is the question that changes everything. How did Adolf Hitler read that guarantee? Not with fear, with calculation. He saw it not as a wall blocking his path, but as a clock on the wall. If Britain and France had drawn a line, it meant the window to act without a general European war was closing. He had not been stopped before, not in the Rhineland, not in Austria, not in Czechoslovakia. But the guarantee signalled that this time the Western powers might actually follow through. That meant speed was everything. That meant he needed to neutralise the one strategic threat that had kept every German military planner awake at night for a generation: the prospect of a war on two fronts simultaneously. And this is where a diplomatic manoeuvre began unfolding in the shadows, one that almost nobody in the West fully grasped until it was far, far too late. While Britain and France were negotiating cautiously with the Soviet Union, exploring whether Moscow might become part of a collective security framework against German aggression, something else was happening in secret. Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, were quietly building an agreement of their own. The two great ideological enemies of the 20th century, Nazi Germany and Soviet communism, were talking. And they were not talking about peace in the abstract. They were talking about Poland. Most observers in the West in the summer of 1939 simply could not process what they were seeing. The idea that Hitler and Stalin could reach a meaningful deal seemed almost absurd on its face. These were regimes that had spent years denouncing each other in the most vitriolic terms imaginable. Surely it was a bluff. Surely it would collapse. Almost no one in the Western capitals fully grasped what a Nazi-Soviet agreement would actually mean before the shooting started. And that failure of imagination would cost Poland everything. Because if that deal went through, Poland would not just be facing Germany from the west. It would face encirclement. It would stand alone, squeezed between two powers that had secretly agreed to divide it between them before a single soldier had crossed a single border. Europe was not sleepwalking toward catastrophe in the summer of 1939. It was being marched there, step by deliberate step, by men who understood exactly what they were building. The peacetime promises were about to collide with the brutal arithmetic of war. And in 35 days, the world would see what that collision looked like. On the 23rd of August 1939, the world woke up to news that stopped diplomatic circles cold. Ribbentrop had flown to Moscow. He and Molotov had signed it. The Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was real, and it was worse than anyone outside those two capitals understood, because what the public saw was a neutrality agreement between two rival powers. What the public did not see was the secret protocol attached to it, buried beneath the diplomatic language, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence as casually as men drawing lines on a map over dinner. Western and Central Poland would fall to Germany. The Eastern two-thirds would fall to the Soviet Union. Poland had been partitioned on paper before a single shot had been fired. Hitler had his guarantee against a two-front war. The clock that the Western guarantee had started was now running out fast. 9 days later, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, from the north, the west, and the south. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast armour supported by air power, designed to shatter defensive lines before they could solidify, to move so quickly that the enemy's command structure collapsed faster than its armies could respond. Polish forces were brave and in places fierce, but they were facing mechanized columns that didn't fight the way the last war had been fought. Polish cavalry facing German armour has become one of history's most misrepresented images, but the underlying reality is true in its own way. Poland was a nation defending with the resources it had against a war machine deliberately engineered to make those resources obsolete overnight. 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France did what their guarantee demanded. On the 3rd of September 1939, both nations declared war on Germany. Chamberlain's voice on the radio that morning carried the weight of a man who had tried everything to prevent the moment he was now announcing. The words were solemn. The commitment was formal. The war was real. And then, on the Western Front, almost nothing happened. France launched what became known as the Saar Offensive, a limited push across the German border into the Saar region. French troops advanced a few miles, encountered German defensive positions, and stopped. The offensive was tentative by design, constrained by a military leadership that had no appetite for the kind of aggressive thrust that might actually have forced Germany to divert forces from Poland. The British Expeditionary Force was crossing to France, but it was nowhere near combat readiness for a major offensive operation, and it certainly was not heading east. The 1,000 miles between the English Channel and the Polish border might as well have been 1,000 light years. No meaningful relief was coming. The Allies had declared war. They had not, in any practical sense, started fighting one. In Warsaw, they were fighting. Polish forces and civilians held the capital under sustained bombardment. At Westerplatte, a tiny garrison of fewer than 200 soldiers held out for 7 days against overwhelming German force before finally surrendering, a defence so stubborn that the German commander reportedly ordered his troops to present arms in salute. On the Hel Peninsula, Polish defenders resisted until the 1st of October. Warsaw itself did not fall until the 28th of September. These were not the actions of a people who had given up. They were the actions of people waiting for help that was not going to come. Because on the 17th of September, the other blade of the pact fell. Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border. The justification offered by Moscow, that the Polish state had ceased to exist and it was merely protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities, was the kind of cynical language that insults the intelligence of anyone listening while simultaneously daring them to object. Poland was now being crushed from both sides. The strategic position that had already been desperate became geometrically impossible. There was no longer a front to hold. There was only the question of how long individual points of resistance could survive. The final Polish military units surrendered on the 6th of October 1939, 35 days from the first German crossing to the last organised Polish resistance. The partition was formalised. Germany annexed the Western Territories and established the brutal occupation administration known as the General Government in the centre. The Soviet Union incorporated the East. The human cost was staggering. Estimates of Polish prisoners taken by both German and Soviet forces reach around 660,000. Civilian deaths during the campaign itself are harder to pin down precisely. Figures vary depending on methodology and source, and honest accounting requires acknowledging that uncertainty, but credible estimates range from roughly 150,000 to 200,000. These are not statistics. They are the measure of what happened when peacetime promises met the silence of the Western Front. And that silence had consequences that rippled far beyond 1939. Back on the Western Front, what followed the Saar offensive's quiet retreat was what history calls the phony war. Months of military inactivity while Poland burned and then lay in ruins. The Allies had the form of war without, for the moment, its substance. Germany had been freed from the nightmare of fighting East and West at once. The secret protocol had done exactly what it was designed to do. Hitler could focus everything westward, knowing the Soviet Union stood behind him rather than against him. The strategic picture that had haunted German planners since the First World War had been dissolved by a document signed in Moscow in the small hours of an August night. The Poles had a word for what they experienced, and a memory that would outlast the war itself. The Western betrayal narrative did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from the simple, brutal arithmetic of what happened. Two nations declared war for Poland, and Poland was destroyed anyway. Whether the Allies could genuinely have saved Poland given the military realities of September 1939 is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is that the gap between the promise and the action was vast, visible, and devastating to everyone who lived inside it. Declaring war, it turned out, was the easy part. Fighting one was something else entirely. If this video has raised questions for you about how Europe reached this point, how Munich collapsed, how the guarantees were made, and why the West spent years avoiding confrontation before finally drawing that line, Part 1 of this series covers all of it. The link is below. The road to September 1939 is as important as September itself, because the lesson of this story isn't just about one invasion in one terrible autumn. It's about what happens when the distance between a promise and the will to keep it becomes wide enough for a war to walk through.